Today on a special edition of MuscleCar.
When I found out that this was a Ray Nichels car, that was important.
Legendary Indy and stock car builder Ray Nichels could make them fast.
It ended up being an EPA car, the only one. That's pretty cool.
This cool bird used to chase planes. We'll show you why and how it may have ended the muscle car era. Plus, Lou's gonna talk dollars and how to make sense before starting your next muscle car project.
You're looking at our next project. It's 40 years old, it's rough, and it's high on the endangered species list. In 1967, this LeMans sold for $2,600. The GTO cost only $300 more. Today, a decent GTO is hard to find and very expensive. So cloning one from a LeMans became very popular. In fact, it's really hard to find a LeMans that's still a LeMans. So we're gonna do our part to preserve history. We're gonna save this one. It wasn't tagged a true muscle car, but the 326 was no slouch. So we'll rebuild it with the hoods from a GTO, and it's gotta go. The rest of the car is pretty much intact and salvageable. Well, almost. We're gonna keep this thing about 90% original. But what's it gonna cost to do that? You need to know before you buy it. Otherwise, you may not finish it. And sometimes your passion and your checkbook just aren't good friends, so let's make a list. It all starts with the body. The top of the fender looks really good, but I gotta see what's under there. This wood screw isn't factory, neither is this anchor. But the metal's not bad. The rest of the rocker looks scary, but it's in surprisingly good shape. The doors are in great shape, and the hinges are rust-free. Got lucky here too. Now the rear quarter panels are a different story. Too much rust on top and too much fiberglass below. Now this would scare a lot of guys off, but it's really not as bad as it looks. They repop this rear panel and you can get a new rear bumper. As far as the taillights go, we're gonna have to check the catalog. The trunk pan's more like a colander and the passenger side quarter speaks for itself. The door's in good shape. This fender's probably the best part of the whole car. The front bumper needs to be re-chromed, the grille we can save, and the headlight bezels need some metal work as well. And that's the major selling point. Almost all the trim is here. If you can't buy it, you can refurbish it. Inside, the seats are perfect. The carpet's rotten, the dash looks great, but there's a crack in the pad. Some panels are shot, but the liner is amazingly tight. Now that you've got your list, where do you get your parts from? Year One is a good source, as well as some other specialty catalogs, but you may have to find a Pontiac-only salvage yard to get the hard stuff. Two rear quarters in sections, $467. Wheel houses, $270. Rear floor pans, $128. Trunk pan, $385. Reconditioned rear bumper, $289. And the list goes on. Not every part for LeMans is repopped, like the hood, the taillights, the rear panel. You could use GTO parts, or you could get online and start looking for those good used ones. Right off the bat, we found several sites with enough used parts to build a car. Estimation for new and used parts, $4,055. We're gonna prep the body for paint ourselves, add another $2,500 to get it painted, and $1,000 for stuff we might have missed. That's gonna put us at just over $7 grand. Don't let that number freak you out. We could have spent more money and bought a nicer car and had a smaller parts list. But for my budget, the smaller investment up front allows me to buy the parts as I can afford them. Either way, 12 grand, you got one hell of a good looking car. We're gonna add up the prices for the suspension, engine, and rest of the drivetrain later on in the show.
Coming up after the break, did a plane-chasing car built by legendary Indy and NASCAR builder Ray Nichels kill the muscle car?
A muscle car that may have helped kill its own kind resurfaces after 35 years. And it worked for the government. But to understand the car, you must first understand the man who built it. Back in the day, Ray Nichels was #1 when it came to building stock cars, but that didn't happen overnight. At 15, Nichols was already crew chief for his father's midget race team. By 1950, he partnered with Paul Russo to race in the Indy 500. This basement-built Indy car, dubbed Basement Bessie, would take ninth at the Brickyard. In '54, at Chrysler's Proving Ground, a Nichols Hemi-powered Curtis Craft 500A, driven by Indy champ Sam Hanks, set the closed course land speed record at 182.55 miles an hour. Stock car racing is in its heyday. Born from the dirt track competition between moonshine runners to see who the best driver was, it is quickly becoming a national pastime. Nichols had become Pontiac's official stock car builder in '56, and the only way to gain respect from the other crew chiefs and drivers was to win. To Nichols, second place was the first loser. He wasn't there to lose. If you weren't careful on the old Daytona Beach course, the sand could put a hurting on you and cost you the race. Cotton Owens was at the wheel of the Nichols No. 6 Pontiac as it tore down the sands of Daytona, crossing the finish line first and setting a new Daytona Beach record of 101.6 miles an hour. In '61, he captured the USAC championship and went on to set world records at the 24-hour speed and endurance run that still stand to this day, putting another notch in Nichols' rank. In '62, he won a championship in USAC and NASCAR, and in '63, another NASCAR championship. Being the house stock car builder for Chrysler since '63, Nichols would break out the new Dodge Charger packing a 426 Hemi at the '66 Firecracker 400. With driver Sam McQuagg, this would be the first of many victories for the Charger. '70 was the last big year for Nichols. Charger Daytonas and Superbirds were killing everybody, and he was building them. Number 71, Bobby Isaac, would become the NASCAR champ in 1970, proving Nichols-built cars were the best. In 1972, Ray Nichels would build his final winged Mopar for a very unlikely client, the Environmental Protection Agency. More of that after the break. Stock car builder Ray Nichels had been turning out winning rides for Indy and NASCAR for almost 2 decades. In 1972, the newly formed Environmental Protection Agency would contract Nichols Engineering to build this stock car-like Superbird. Its purpose? The war on air pollution. Driving the car, John B. Moran, an EPA section chief of the Automotive and Stationary Emissions Research. He would use the car to collect data on particulates and emissions from automobiles and jet aircraft. The first steps were done at the Charlotte Motor Speedway, testing brake pads for asbestos and polyglass tires for harmful particulates. The final testing is done at Raleigh-Durham International Airport, sampling particulate emissions from jet engines. Moran had his doubts on how this test would work out.
The first time I chased a jet, I did not know what was going to happen. I had made the calculations and I'd looked at the aerodynamics and the wind tunnel data from Chrysler, and it should work.
According to Moran, there's actual footage of this car chasing a plane down the runway. But until we find that, this will give you a really good idea. The airliner would taxi onto the tarmac and then hold till the Superbird was in position. All instruments and sampling devices were double-checked on the car. The air suspension was engaged. By dropping the nose of the Superbird close to the ground, the chances of the turbine forcing winds under the car and blowing it off the tarmac were neutralized. Once everything was set, he informed the tower and waited. When Moran heard "cleared for takeoff," it was on. The pilot would let off the brake, Moran would let off the clutch, catapulting them both down the runway. Probes mounted in the nose of the car and on the top of the rear wing would capture particulates that were emitted from the jet. The data collected would tell just how much pollution was actually coming from the aircraft.
So after that, I knew the car wasn't going to blow away.
The EPA Superbird recently resurfaced on the internet, so we had to send a crew from MuscleCar to check it out. It was a winter morning when the MuscleCar crew arrived in Middlefield, Connecticut. This town is full of scenery and historical landmarks, grain mills, apple orchards, the Lyman gun sight factory, Lake Bessick, and of course, a rare Superbird. The E-Muscle Restoration Shop is where this Mopar had recently been spotted. Surrounded by different restored muscle cars, this Superbird was right at home. The car had been in Goldston, North Carolina, until E-Muscle owner Brian Chafee got a hold of it in the fall of 2006. It had undergone a factory restoration by a previous owner in the early 80s. And there were only two telltale items that told you what this car was: the EPA sticker on the windshield and the Nichols engineering plaque on the dash. Packing a 440, this Superbird originally came in Alpine white with a black vinyl top and a standard black interior. Some of the Go Fast factory options included rebuilding the 440 so it could run over 100 miles an hour for up to 2 hours. A vacuum pump, a control gauge that operated the rear air suspension. Originally, it was an automatic on the column, but changed over to a heavy-duty 4-speed Hurst, and a NASCAR-style fuel cell was installed in the trunk. The dash was outfitted with a shift light, a decelerometer, and an aircraft transceiver radio. The custom exhaust pipes were designed so the test equipment wouldn't sample the car's own exhaust. It may not have been a full-blown stock car, but it was pretty close. If you don't believe this thing could fly, ask Officer Scott Halligan with the Middlefield PD. He had first-hand experience. Brian knows his crew is good enough to restore this car back to Nichols specs.
The core of E-Muscle is getting the best guys in the business that are passionate about muscle cars, that work on them, own them, and deal with it every day. Nothing leaves here unless it's perfect because of the team that I have.
When I found out that this was a Ray Nichels car and there was only 3 left, that was important. But on top of that, it ended up being an EPA car, the only one. That was something that threw it over the top. So the amount of research that has to go through to bring this car back to the way Ray Nichels left it when he handed the keys over to JP Moran, that's pretty cool.
Judging by the combined restoration work and enthusiasm of the E-Muscle team, this bird was in the right place. By the time Moran completed his testing and analyzing his data, muscle cars were pretty much at the end, making this car a very likely suspect. Now it's time to see if this was the car responsible for killing all the muscle cars. Only one man can tell us that.
The way to look at the issue of the relationship of the car with lead and gasoline told us that particulate emissions from mobile sources could constitute a serious public health threat. So the car was a growth of that knowledge to the extent that we wanted to evaluate other mobile sources and stationary source emissions for particulate material. So while lead got banned, the hue and cry of the impact on the automotive industry was long and loud, and the basic work that I did led to that. It takes time, but things are a lot better now than they were then.
This Superbird helped kill the muscle car, all in the name of the environment. It forced the oil companies and auto manufacturers to start producing cleaner burning fuel and efficient modern muscle. It just took longer than anyone expected. The restoration is underway, and MuscleCar will be there for a special test drive when it's done.
If you had the opportunity to run that car one more time down a tarmac and chase a jet aircraft, would you do it again?
If conditions were right, I would do it.
That'll be really cool when that happens, but I gotta get back on my list for the LeMans, and we'll do that after the break. We're gonna finish our parts list to restore this endangered 67 LeMans. To this point, the tally for the interior and body was just under $7 grand. Now we're gonna do the same for everything that makes it go. Our plan is to rebuild this stock 326. Why? Because they too were sacrificed in the making of GTO clones. What would save us a lot of money is if the crank is still usable. After some teardown time, my hopes of that are quickly crashing on the jagged rocks below. Take a look at this. This is paraffin. They put it in oil to help it lubricate. When you don't change your oil, it builds up. And it usually means that there's scarring on all your major moving parts. That's the risk you take. You never know what's inside till you bust it open. But I've never seen an engine this bad. Ooh. Oh, look at that. It's so bad that it's clogged up the screen. It's make or break time. There's a groove on the bearings and scoring on the cranks, but it's not as bad as I thought. According to the factory specs, where we're at now, this crank is still salvageable. Surprisingly, these cylinders are in really good shape. That's pretty good considering the neglect that this thing has suffered. We've got a good block, heads, rod, and crank. This thing's rebuildable. I found a complete kit with everything you need to start it up for about $1,400. Add the machine work to that to recondition your parts, about $1,000. So to rebuild your stock engine, close to $2,400. That's not bad at all, but we found another option that interests us. For $279, Eagle has a stroker crank for the 400 that'll fit our 326, transforming it into a 370, 375. Add an Edelbrock intake with 2 carbs, some custom pistons, rods, etc., along with some additional headwork, and you're looking at just under $5,000 for a serious little torque monster. This stroker crank is made possible because in '67, the 326, the 389, and the 400 all shared the same block, just with different bore and stroke combinations. But we're going to keep our 326, sorta. So there's 2 options for your engine. You've got some for your rear end as well. If you're going to run the 326, this one will do just fine. Black paint, rebuild the brakes, spring shocks, you're good to go. But if you're going to run a stroker like we are, you might want to consider something a little bit stronger, like a Moser 12-bolt. Either way, refreshing our front suspension is fine. The frame needs to be painted, on or off the body. Add a drive shaft, exhaust, brake, and gas lines, along with something to put your gas in. The last thing to add to our list is roughly $350 to rebuild your stock Power Glide. You could convert it to a 4-speed for about $2,400. Either one will hold up to the stroker, but I prefer the third pedal. Here are your totals. For a rebuilt stock driveline, about $5,500. For a modified driveline, $12,000. To get the body work right, $7,000. Cost of the car, $4,000. So, for a very nice restored matching number LeMans, $16,500. For a very nice restored LeMans with a stroker, Moser rear end, 4-speed, and disc brake conversion, $23,000. That's the list I worked up before I bought the car, and it's all based on doing the work yourself. You might save some money along the way, but you'll find stuff to eat that up. If this were a weekend project for me, it'd take a couple of years, but through the magic of TV, about 5 shows. Till then, go out, find your dream car, and get busy. Later.